The large cruiser or battlecruiser of 1912, provisionally named Kaiserin Augusta, later changed to Lützow, was the second ship in the Deflinge class. For the most part, both Deflinge and Lützow were the same, having minimal differences, namely in their armament. Although initially commissioned in August 1915, she wouldn't see service until February 1916 due to issues with her machinery. Participating in several operations, notably in April the shelling of Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth, most famously being the flagship for Admiral Franz von Hipper at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916. However, early in the morning the following day, her damage proved too much, and she was scuttled by her crew. In today's video, we're going to look at SMS Lützow at Jutland, much like our video on Warspite. Now, Lützow had only been in service very briefly at this point, and she and her sister Deflinge were some of the most powerful ships in the High Seas Fleet. Their 305mm guns, speed, and armor were certainly nothing for the Royal Navy to sneeze at. Still, there is an interesting quote from a member of the Naval Department when the designs of Deflinge and Lützow were being decided. This is found in Gary Staff's German Battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations. One must expect that the ship will fill with water forward. Leaks will occur that cannot be sealed with the means available on board. The ship's outer hull, to which the armor is secured, will undoubtedly leak, and the forecastle ahead of the citadel will certainly fill. It could not be kept drained with the means available on board. Another thing I think you need to bear in mind is why Admiral Franz von Hipper, and yes, I do realize he gets his title due to the Battle of Jutland, why was he on board Lützow, and not, say, Seydlitz, the ship he had been using as his flagship beforehand? Well, back in late April, Seydlitz had struck a mine in advance on the English coastline, where she would make it back to Germany and be repaired in time for Jutland. It's just that these repairs lasted until May 18th, when it was revealed that the repair work was a bit shoddy, and the ship had some leakage. Because of this, Hipper transferred his flag to Lützow for the upcoming operation. Early in the morning on Wednesday, the 31st of May, per Operational Order 6, Lützow, with Hipper on board, weighed anchor and led the German scouting groups into the North Sea. Things were relatively quiet for Lützow and the scouting groups up until 2:20, when the cruiser Elbing reported smoke from the southwest. By 3:20, the first scouting group increased speed to 25 knots, to catch what turned out to be British light cruisers. Just 3 minutes later, British battlecruisers were spotted, these being the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser squadrons under the command of Admiral David Beatty. At 3:30, after observing the British movements, Hipper understood that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base, and accordingly turned on a southeasterly course, as to appear to be in full retreat back to the Jade. Now, to quote from Nick Jellicoe's Jutland the Unfinished Battle, he writes, "The Germans could read Beatty's character perhaps better than Beatty realized. They knew he was a fox-hunting man. They knew that he would run into the chase, and that this was their chance to lure a portion of British naval forces into the waiting guns of Shear, heading north not far behind with the main battle fleet." On the flagship there was high tension about, as an officer aboard Lützow writes about Vice Admiral Hipper later. High tension dominates with all the crew, as after scarcely 1 hour after sighting British light forces, smoke clouds and heavy masses of ships climb over the horizon. I hear, as Admiral Hipper up on the Admiral's Bridge said to his Chief of Staff in his Bavarian dialect, "Rada, I'll eat my broomstick if that's not Beatty again." That Chief of Staff being the future Admiral Ash Rada. Hipper ordered fire distribution from the left, ship against ship, meaning that Lützow fired on Beatty's flagship Lion, next Deflinge fired on Princess Royal, Seydlitz on Queen Mary, Moltke on Tiger, and von der Tann on Indefatigable. At 3:48 p.m., as Beatty closed the range even further, Hipper stood on the bridge of Lützow calmly smoking a cigar, giving the order to open fire, upon which the thunderous roar of the German guns opened up the Battle of Jutland. Interestingly enough, Korvettenkapitän Paschen, the first artillery officer of Lützow, has this to say: "Our rangefinders gave us good ranges, commencing at 240 hectometers, and it seemed an eternity. It was 20 minutes before we had reached our range of 190 hectometers. Even then, we had to wait for the Seydlitz. The range was further reduced. 5 points, 57 degrees is the enemy's bearing. Estimated speed 26 knots. Course 110 degrees. This made the rate of closing 4 hectometers a minute. At a range of 167 hectometers by our calculations, the first turret salvo from A and B turrets was fired at 4:48. And do keep in mind, besides in quotes, I'll be using Greenwich Mean Time. The first few moments are described by Defling as gunnery officer George Hassa in Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, in the Winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey. Hassa writes, "The 6 ships, which had been proceeding in 2 columns, formed a single line ahead, like a herd of prehistoric monsters. They closed on one another with slow movements, spectre-like, irresistible. At the last, there was a dull roar. The Lützow is firing her first salvo, and immediately the signal 'Open fire' is hoisted. In the same second, I shout 'Salvos fire,' and the thunder of our first salvo crashes out. Lützow, targeting Lion, scored 2 hits at 3:51 and at 3:52. Then, at 3:57, Lützow achieved a hit on Lion's Q turret, blowing off the roof of the turret, putting the turret out of action, and later causing a massive cordite fire. At 4 p.m., Lützow suffered the first of 2 hits, both on the forecastle deck, where Paschen describes these hits as quite the surprise, as Lion had been rather inaccurate to this point. By 4:05, as Lion sheared out of line and disappeared, things appeared to be going well for the Germans, as just 3 minutes earlier, Indefatigable had been destroyed. German gunnery was superb, as Lützow had scored 6 hits from 31 salvos, while in comparison, Lion and Princess Royal scored a combined 3 hits on Lützow. As the battle raged and the 2 sides exchanged fire, Lützow changed targets to Princess Royal. At 4:15, Princess Royal scored a hit on Lützow in the forward dressing station, killing or wounding everyone there. Another interesting quote from Paschen is, 17 minutes after fire was opened, the Lion turned sharply away until we could see her from aft, and Princess Royal pushed in front. I counted 6 hits and 31 salvos. We were hit 3 times. One of these exploded between A and B turrets and cleared out the forward action dressing station. All are dead there. Hit number 3 seems to have hit the belt somewhere. A heavy shock, but nothing put out of action. Following the loss of Queen Mary, Beatty turned his remaining battlecruisers north towards Jellicoe and the Grand Fleet due to the reports of the oncoming German High Seas Fleet. As Beatty steamed north, Evan Thomas and HMS Barham steamed south, leading the 5th Battle Squadron, as they had not yet received the signal to turn north. Seeing this, at 4:44, Hipper ordered the battleships to be taken under fire, where Lützow scored a hit on Barham that same minute. At 4:51, as the 5th Battle Squadron fought against the German battlecruisers, the High Seas Fleet came into view with the advance line of Koning-class battleships led by Admiral Reinhard Scheer. So far, Lützow had hit the enemy 10 times while suffering only 4 hits in return. As the run to the south came to an end and the run to the north began for Lützow, she targeted Lion, obtaining 3 more hits between 4:59 and 5:02. The German ships continued to chase down the 5th Battle Squadron and the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons. Barham scored a hit on Lützow that struck the armored belt ahead of a 5.9-inch casemate. Another 2 shells struck between the funnels, destroying the main and reserve wireless, depriving Hipper of his link to the rest of his scouting groups. We're taking from Paschen again. At 5:41, we were heavily fired at by him and are hit 4 times. 2 of these pierced the large 6-inch casemate from above, destroying both wireless sets and causing severe casualties. Another burst amidships without seriously injuring the main armor deck, but the fastenings in the gunnery transmitting station, which were underneath, came adrift, and smoke penetrated everywhere. The fire control was interrupted momentarily, but was restarted shortly afterwards. Our smoke became a nuisance. For a short time, I had to let the after position carry on fire control. The enemy has, for the moment, the upper hand, and I cannot get rid of the idea that trouble is brewing. At 5:30 and then 5:45, shells from Valiant and Princess Royal struck Lützow, further damaging the superstructure and more 5.9-inch guns. At around this time, Horace Hood and the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron unexpectedly appeared to the east. Hipper, turning to counter this threat, came under fire from both the 3rd and 1st British Battlecruiser Squadrons. At 5:59, Hipper carried out a battle turn onto the opposite course to withdraw and then close with his main body. At 6:05 and 6:10, Lützow hit Lion. At 6:15, the Grand Fleet began forming their battle line. As a part of the 1st Cruiser Squadron, Defense and Warrior, which had been firing on the Wiesbaden, suddenly became visible to the 1st Scouting Group and came under withering fire, with Defense sinking at 6:20. With the 1st and 3rd Battlecruiser squadrons enveloping the head of the German line, Lützow came under increasing fire. Between 6:26 and 6:34, Lützow was hit 8 times from Invincible and Inflexible. The most devastating were 2 12-inch hits that struck the forward broadside torpedo room and 2 that struck the bow torpedo room, with the entire forecastle from 249 and below the waterline immediately filling with seawater. Again, Paschen writes, "Every ship has weak spots. Our Achilles heel was the broadside torpedo flat, situated forward of A turret. Here, unfortunately, for reasons of space, the torpedo bulkhead, that incomparable protection against hits below the waterline, which was a marked advantage in German warships as compared with foreign ones, had been left out. So 2 heavy enemy shells succeeded in penetrating under the belt and burst so effectively that the whole of the ship forward of A turret filled practically at once." Speed had to be reduced down to 15 knots. At 6:30, one of Lützow's assailants suddenly became visible. In Gary Staff's German Battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations, Korvettenkapitän Paschen writes, "Meanwhile, we had turned onto a southerly course, and suddenly, an English battlecruiser of the Invincible type appeared out of the haze, clearly and relatively near, 4 points to port astern. I cannot say strongly enough what satisfaction I felt to finally have this pest presented before my eyes. And as quick as lightning, the commands were given out. But already, a dark object slides between my periscope and the opponent, the corner of the Admiral's bridge, which limits the angle of my vision of my periscope object lens to about 10 degrees. As the aft position measured, jawohl, 100 hectometers. Direction aft position, Kapitänleutnant Bode gives brief and clear orders, and to the inexpressible joy of the whole ship, 15 seconds later, our guns crash out again, except B turret. I heard everything myself through the headphones, what Bode and the artillery transmitting station said, and now also saw the opponents again. Over. 4 down, salvo, straddle, salvo. As the sound of the fall of shot indicator screeched, the columns flickered out of the water around the enemy, and again, the beautiful and unmistakable dark red flares up. And the shell detonated in the turret, blowing off the roof. A great explosion followed as the magazine detonated. The ship broke in 2 and sank." However, things for Lützow were taking a turn for the worse, as seawater continued to pour into her forward compartments, dragging her bow deeper into the water. Eventually, under heavy fire, the German destroyer G-39 came alongside, and Hipper and his staff began to leave the ship, with Ehrschrede, Hipper's chief of staff, recounting his exchange with Admiral Hipper. A kind of paralysis seemed to descend on Hipper. He issued no orders. It was the first time that he had nothing to say. After having been told he must leave the ship, Rada once again asked, "We can't lead the squadron from Lützow anymore, Your Excellency." "But I can't leave the flagship," Hipper protested. Rada persisted. "We're unable to signal by wireless, and anyhow, our speed isn't enough." "No doubt," said Hipper, "but my flagship." Then Rada spoke sharply. "The squadron needs Your Excellency." And Hipper jerked back to reality. "You're right." Hipper grabbed the captain's hand, Victor Hada, and saluted the officers on the bridge, and just like Beatty at Dogger Bank, jumped onto a destroyer and told the captain to find him another battlecruiser. At about this time, the Grand Fleet crossed the T of the High Seas Fleet once again, and to cover the High Seas Fleet's withdrawal, Admiral Scheer ordered the battlecruisers to the van, and they were used to cover the retreat of the High Seas Fleet. Lützow, being heavily damaged, took course to the southwest to withdraw from enemy fire. But at 7:15, she came under fire from the British battleships Monarch and Orion, hitting Lützow a total of 6 times between 7:15 and 7:30, causing more damage, putting B turret out of action, and further hits to the deck and belt. The final hit during this period was sent to the top of the main mast, sending it crashing onto the deck. Lützow crept off, and at 7:40, the enemy ceased fire, making just 3 to 5 knots with 4 escorting torpedo boats. At 9:15, there was approximately 2,395 tons of water on the ship. As the night dragged on, the crew worked on pumping the water out of the ship. But by midnight on June 1st, the forward group of pumps had failed, and water began penetrating the boiler rooms, with the last figures from damage control indicating that there were 4,209 tons of water below the armored deck and 4,124 tons above, giving a total of 8,351 tons. This still increased as the draft forward was approximately 17 meters. Shortly after 1 a.m., Captain Hada gave the order to abandon ship, with 4 torpedo boats, G-40, G-38, V-45, and G-37 coming alongside, 3 at a time to take off crew, with Kapitan Leutnant Jung running after the fact. The survivors assembled on the quarterdeck. Above them fluttered the battle flag, shot to pieces by the enemy shells. Where there was no longer any offizier, the senior Unteroffizier took command. Still, it was a black night. Only in the east the hesitating dawn appeared, heralding the new day. The address of the commander was short and concise. He concluded with the request we be proud of SMS Lützow and her crew today for their selfless and extraordinary service to their fatherland. Then 3 cheers were called for the ship and Kaiser. And now go to the boats. The last words of the commander were almost paternal, sounding out of the dark. They touched the deepest emotions of all of his subordinates. Captain Hada was the last man to leave the ship, and Hada ordered G-38 to fire 2 torpedoes. Lützow, upon receiving the blow, rolled over and went down, while in Castles of Steel, Robert K. Massey writes, while the ship's company, watching from the destroyers, gave 3 cheers for the Kaiser, 3 for Hipper and Scheer, and 3 for their ship. Then, across the empty water, they raised their voices in Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. The time was at 2:47 a.m. on June 1st when she went down. Another account comes from Lützow's first artillery officer, Gunther Paschen, and fair warning, it's rather lengthy. The ship is well down by the head. The deck at the bows is on level with the water. I hear that practically the whole forepart of the ship is waterlogged. Only one of the switch rooms is clear of water, and there are several men down there below the level of the water on the upper platform deck. To help them was impossible. The speed of the ship had been reduced to 7 knots on the earnest representations of the first officer, but with the corresponding revolutions, she probably only developed about 5. The very low forecastle, Lützow had no upper forward deck, was now underwater. More sea had got up from the southwest and was breaking on the forecastle among the heaps of empty cartridge cases. We were all deadbeats, officers, men, and the night dragged on endlessly. What of the morning? I always had hopes for the ship, but at midnight, when the captain called the senior officers to a conference, the commander reported 7,500 tons of water on board and expressed his opinion that, at the most, we could keep afloat till 6 a.m. The news was a dreadful blow. The noble ship, but it had to be. The bows were now 2 meters underwater, which was pouring through the open doors of the casemate into the battery and through the torn-up plating onto the middle deck. The great oil boiler rooms forward had to be abandoned to save the men there. The draft forward was 17 meters. The captain, who up until now had steadily steered the ship in the direction in which the fleet had last been seen, sadly gave in to prevent the useless sacrifice of human life that would have occurred if she had not been abandoned. Shortly after 1 a.m. came the order, all aft, and the 4 destroyers that had stayed with us were ordered alongside, aft on the starboard side. I had not recollected them, and was agreeably surprised at not having to swim. As long as there was time, I went around the ship with the other officers in trusted ratings, looking for wounded and men who were asleep. Sure enough, I found one gallant fellow fast asleep on the bench in the gunnery flat. The sight in the 6-inch battery was indescribably desolate. Most of our casualties had been there. The disembarkation of the crew was carried out perfectly. First the wounded, and then the rest without any trouble. As we cast off in the last boat, I saw the ship in the gray light of the morning. A turret underwater, B an island. Near the bridge, the water was up to the superstructure. The stern was about 2 meters higher than usual. Then one of the destroyers fired a torpedo which hit amidships, whereupon the ship, for a moment, heeled over to starboard. It only needed a slight impact to hasten the sinking by 1 or 2 hours. Finally, we'll look at a letter from an unknown officer. The forecastle sank continually deeper, and the stern always came higher. Towards 3 a.m., it was clear that the ship could no longer be held. We stopped and called the torpedo boats alongside. Then all men went aft, wearing life vests, but thankfully they were not needed. The men transferred to the torpedo boats after the wounded had been taken across. I myself went through the compartments with another lieutenant to ensure everyone, including the wounded, was out. Then I climbed over the last boot, G-38, and with us, the commander. He was the last to quit the beautiful ship. It cut into my heart to have to quit our beautiful ship. It also pulls my heart when, officially or otherwise, they begin to complain. With one torpedo shot from our boot, the ship went to rest. Slowly, it lay over to the side and capsized. At that same time, I had to think about the 6 poor stokers that were still alive when the ship sank. They sat in the forward diesel dynamo switch room just as a diving bell and could not get out. They called me once, as I had connection with them, and reported that the water was slowly rising into their room. It was held by pumps at a certain height. They maintained courage and optimism until the last. They were still trapped. The night for the crew was not over. In the grey dawn of the morning, there was a brief firefight between the torpedo boats and 3 British destroyers as they made their way towards Horn's Reef. Soon after, with 2 British light cruisers and about 6 destroyers, G40 received a hit in the starboard turbine and was slowed to 10 knots. The British group did not take up pursuit, and therefore the other boats took G40 in tow. Making a turn at 9:45, the boats, along with Regensburg and some of the crew, transferred to Regensburg. The group reached Wilhelmshaven sometime in the evening of June 1st. Lützow is reported as having lost 128 seamen and officers during and after the battle. Following their return to Germany, a number of the crew were awarded with the Iron Cross First Class, with Captain Hodder and his executive officer being given new commands immediately after Jutland, with Hodder going on to command the new fleet flagship Baden. A majority of Lützow's crew were assigned to Baden. Many still retained their Lützow cap bands. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at SMS Lützow. Although having a short career, it was certainly action-packed. I'll leave you with a quote that I find appropriate. The quote coming from German battlecruisers of World War I. The final design of Der Flinge was a striking ship, and with it, German shipbuilders reached a pinnacle as far as completed Panzerkreuzer battlecruisers were concerned. This class of 3 ships is often regarded as the best all-around capital ships of the period, and aesthetically is amongst the most handsome. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great week.